on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I have an X-Men fan theory for you guys about a couple of kind of minor characters in the X-Men universe. One character is Sidorak, or Sidorak. I've always said Sidorak. That is the demon who gave the Juggernaut his powers, and the mutant named the Shadow King, who is one of the first mutants that Professor Xavier encountered, the first evil mutant that he encountered at least, who was an on-again, off-again threat throughout the 1980s mostly, although he's shown up a few times since the 1980s. But recently I read the conclusion of Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men, which ended with a big battle against the Shadow King. And I came across some stuff that made me question some of the stuff that we had been told about him before. The first time the Shadow King showed up, I don't remember the issue number, but most of the issue was a flashback where we get to see before the founding of the X-Men, when Charles Xavier was still walking. He was somewhere in the Middle East, and he met a man named Amal Farak, and that character was the Shadow King, and they had a psychic battle right there in the middle of a restaurant, and then the Shadow King seemingly died. And then years later, we see that he's not quite dead. He was able to survive on the astral plane, and he menaced the X-Men for a good little bit. And reading the conclusion of Claremont's run on the X-Men, there are a few things that we find out that, as far as I know, we had never been told before. One thing, Professor Xavier believes that the Shadow King could be much older than what we initially thought. He says he could have been taking over various physical bodies for centuries, even. And that is not something that we were necessarily told whenever we first saw the Shadow King. In fact, I think many people, myself included, always believed that Amal Farak was his actual form. But we find out in another issue in the Muir Island saga that the Shadow King merely used the body of Amal Farak, and that was not his actual form. At least his dialogue seems to indicate that that was not his original body, and that was just a body that he had taken over. What little we do know about the Shadow King, he does claim the Middle East as his place of origin, which the name Amal Farak kind of indicates that that body was from the Middle East also. So before he met Charles Xavier, it doesn't seem like the Shadow King had a whole lot of power to his name. Now, after his seeming death at the hands of Charles Xavier, it seems like, in a kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi type way, if you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. It seems like it was his death that actually gave him a huge power boost, because after he was seemingly killed, that's when we see him kind of doing stuff on a big global scale. He is able to influence or outright control dozens of people at a time all across the world, and that doesn't seem like something that he was able to do before he met Charles Xavier. And if Xavier is right, and he has been around for centuries, it definitely doesn't make any sense that he had that scale of power. Otherwise, he would have already taken over the world before he ever met Charles Xavier. So it seems to me that he was on the lower power levels before he met Charles Xavier, and then being defeated on the astral plane, somehow that gives him a boost so that he's able to act more freely after that defeat. The connection that I believe is present between the Shadow King and Sidorak, the demon who gave Juggernaut his powers, is that when the Juggernaut is first introduced back in the 1960s, it was like around issue 12, something like that, we see that in the Korean War, he and Charles Xavier were fighting, and then Kane goes into this cave and sees a gem, and he touches it, and then he becomes the Juggernaut. And we find out that becoming the Juggernaut has given him powers that basically buffers him against telepathy. Now, a psychic cannot enter the Juggernaut's mind whenever he has the powers of Sidorak, and specifically the helmet that he wears. That is what protects him against telepathy. Now, the reason that they did this is so that Charles Xavier, who spent an entire issue telling the X-Men what a threat the Juggernaut was, he's not able to just use his telepathy to shut him down. They have to find another way to defeat him. And so that's why they did it in the story. But you may be wondering, why did Sidorak have a gem that protects his avatar on Earth against telepathy? I'm thinking the Shadow King had maybe encountered Sidorak or one of his agents a long time ago, before we had ever met the Juggernaut, or Charles Xavier had even been born. It's possible that Sidorak had multiple agents through the centuries, and that Kane Marco is just the most recent one who bears the power of Sidorak. And if that's the case, I'm wondering if one of the previous Juggernauts who worked for Sidorak maybe encountered the Shadow King at one point, and then maybe the Shadow King was able to take over this agent and suddenly he has a whole lot more power than he's ever had before. And then maybe Sidorak thinks, okay, this isn't good. We've got this Earth mutant who took over my guy. I'm going to have to take away his powers, and I'm going to have to think of a way to block telepathy so that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. I don't think that Sidorak was necessarily acting in the best interests of planet Earth. Every time that we see Sidorak, which isn't very often, he seems like a bad guy, and that makes sense. He gives powers to a bad guy, but maybe he sees someone else who's also a bad guy, and he says, yeah, I'm not a superhero or anything, but that guy is a threat to me, so I'm going to have to think of a way to block his powers so that he doesn't try and take away my power in the future. So this is a minor theory, but everything that I see kind of lines up with it. So I think maybe it's possible that the Shadow King has had some dealings with Sidorak and one of the previous Juggernauts, if there were previous Juggernauts, which, again, we don't have any reason to think that there weren't. Or if it wasn't the Shadow King, then it might have been another telepath sometime in the past. Although, with the Shadow King being theorized as being centuries old, I like to think that it was the Shadow King. So that was my theory. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll be back later in the future with other videos. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.